So as we continue just talking about manuscripts in the New Testament, I want to talk a little bit about what the material it was written on. So the New Testament was written on really three different types of material. The first was papyrus. That's usually the oldest kind of material, and papyrus is an ancient writing surface that's made from a plant called a papyrus plant. And the earliest extant copies of the New Testament are written on this material. And you'll see this in the textual apparatus. There's actually a designation, an abbreviation with a really pretty P that's written to demonstrate or to communicate that's a papyrus document. The next is parchment, or sometimes called vellum. And parchment is a common writing surface that we see when we dig stuff up out of the ground from the 4th century to really the 14th century. And it's made of animal skin, and tanners would take the hides of skin of the animals and they would clean them and stretch them really large and thin to create sheets of material that later on people could write on. So these sheets of vellum or of parchment were folded into what were called queries, which were gathered parchment leaves essentially. And these were often grouped together and they created folded queries, and they were bound in what is called a codex, which is just an ancient version of a book. And the last is this new form of technology called paper. And paper, when both parchment and paper were available for manuscript production, this really took place post 14th century. So this is really the 15th century. And really, in a lot of ways, prepared the way for the writing press to take place. And so widespread opinion held that parchment was more durable of those two material in that period, but paper, therefore, at the time seemed less common because it was desired less in a sense until the advent truly of the printing press, the Gutenberg printing press. And so once paper production increased, the material was more frequently selected. We also see something called a lectionary, which was usually on parchment or animal skin, but this was usually a commentary on a passage and not necessarily a whole book. So those are the materials that the New Testament was written on. And then there were writing styles, and I want to talk a little bit about that in this video. So the three types were the majuscules, the unicals, or the round style, and the minuscules. So the majuscules, unicals, and minuscules. So let's dive into each one. The majuscule writing is always in a capital letter format, in our case, because we're studying the New Testament, in a Greek capital letters. So scribes used the majuscule handwriting from the 4th century BC until about the 9th century AD. We do find from time to time usage of script continuing in the 9th century in some liturgical texts because it was a style. But that style really changed throughout the period in its use, but it remained primarily in a capital form. And so they're not all exactly in capital form, but as you study Greek and as you learn the Greek alphabet, you'll sort of begin to see this if you actually were to look at a majuscule document, okay? The next, again, are the unicals. So the unicals are also capital letters, but it's a more specific kind of majuscule script known for round, flowing, simplified forms. And it really developed around the 4th century. In a contrast, majuscule, again, is a more broad, descriptive term for a large letter or capital letter script. But unical is sort of a style within that category that we see a lot in the New Testament manuscripts. The last, again, is that minuscule, which is, again, mostly lowercase. And it's a more compact form and efficient form of writing. And it developed after majuscule handwriting. And so over the course of its use, minuscule handwriting morphed into different styles, including many ligatures and handwritten forms that we'll see, especially as you get into further Greek and Aramaic writing, and as you look at manuscripts. One of the things you'll notice as you look at a manuscript, and we'll be looking at some of those copies of some of those in our class, is that often there was no period. There was no spacing. And why would that be? Well, because these materials were so rarefied that the writer had to make sure to use every available space on the document. And so literally letter is lined up next to letter, and there might be a small space or a small marker to demonstrate that that sentence ends, but really it just continues on with the next sentence. And you'll see that both in a capital form, but also in a lowercase form. And so it becomes very important to really understand how those letters are written and formatted, and not to be sloppy in your learning with the letter formations, because it'll become very important as you actually look not at a document that was printed recently, using a printing press or print on demand book, but when we actually look at the old manuscripts, you'll see how critical it is that those letters are understood in your mind, so you can actually interpret and read the document. It feels like a little bit like, if you've ever done one of those word searches, when you're beginning Greek and maybe you're a second year Greek student, you begin to be able to pick out different words and recognize those patterns, and it becomes a lot like a word search where you're trying to figure out where one word ends and where another begins. But it's important for you to see that and to understand that. All right, well, I want to talk a little bit about the major families of manuscripts, and I won't finish that in this video, but I just want to sort of highlight the major ones as we jump in. I'll do a whole nother video on those manuscripts. But the first is the Alexandrian family of manuscripts. The second is the Byzantinian or the Byzantine family of manuscripts, sometimes called the majority text. It represents probably the largest surviving set of New Testament manuscripts because it was in the Byzantine Empire. And so it has different names. Sometimes it's called the Byzantinian family, sometimes called the majority text, or the traditional text, or the ecclesiology text, or the Antiochian text, or even the Syrian text. And so we'll dive into each one of these, but I just want to sort of name them. There is also some other families. One is called the Western family. So this is a group of manuscripts that was circulated in the Western Roman Empire and associated with early Latin translations. And finally, there's the Caesarean family that represents a smaller and more enigmatic group of manuscripts that were originated in the region of Caesarea in the 3rd or 4th century. So that's a lesser known family. As you look at Greek families, usually there's 3 major families, and the Caesarean family is really a newcomer on the scene here in scholarship, as it's been added recently to the group of families. But those are the 4 families of different styles of texts and where they come from. We'll be looking at some of the most important codices and papyrus documents in the next video. But these will include, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Papyrus 52, Papyrus 46, Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Alexandrinus, Codex Bezae, and probably some more like the Chester Beatty papyri as well. But this is, again, where we're headed, and it's why it's important for you to, if you need to, watch this video over again, and you can research some of these families online. Of course, if you come to our class, we'll talk specifically about all of this, and there's no rush. We're really trying to immerse ourselves into all of the scholarly information so that you become a really solid Bible knowledge student and are able to defend and communicate your faith in a well-rounded context. All right, we'll see you in the next video.